A master narcissist, H. G. Tudor, says, "What is the empathic supernova?" In order to detail this phenomenon, it is first necessary to consider when it might appear and what is behind its appearance. The repeated application of our manipulations is deployed for the purposes of maintaining control over you. This control reinforces our notion of superiority, omnipotence and impregnability, and enables us to draw fuel from our appliances and most of all you as our primary source. I have made mention of the empathic group, the group which lies to the left of the empathic narcissistic spectrum, and within this group there are three schools of the empathic individual: the codependent, the super-empath and the empath. The sustained application of the many and varied manipulations produces results for us. It also takes its toll on our victims. The codependent will cling on, desperate for the self-definition which manifests as a consequence of their ensnarement with us. They will soak up the abuse, the confusion and the control until they reach a point of breakdown. The cumulative effect of the silent treatments, the gaslighting, the physical abuse, the psychological trauma, financial mistreatment and sexual degradation eventually causes the limpet-like codependent to collapse into numbness, malfunction and potential hospitalization. They gave and gave until suddenly they fell off the cliff, and their fuel provision remained impressive on Monday, and by Tuesday it had stopped. No longer capable of pumping out fuel, attending to our requirements and showering us with appropriate traits and residual benefits, this failure to function invariably brings about the discard of this individual. The discarded codependent, although distraught at the loss of the narcissist which they crave, is in no position to try to bring about the resumption of the relationship, and thus, whilst we focus on their replacement primary source, they are allowed a period by which they can recover, and once the lights switch back on again and the fuel starts to pump, the devaluation of their replacement has begun, so we come looking and hoovering for the codependent. Unable to resist, because of the nature of the hoovering and their own vulnerability, they are hoovered back in and the narcissistic cycle continues. Whilst third parties may try to assist the codependent to see and understand what has happened to them, their own substantial need to connect with a narcissist means it is very hard to make them take notice and stay away from us. Unless physically removed and isolated, the codependent will drift back to us. If not the original narcissist, a replacement narcissist will invariably be found. The empathic narcissistic spectrum is a sliding scale that represents both empathic and narcissistic traits. On the far left, the empathic traits are more numerous and stronger, whilst the narcissistic traits are fewer and weaker. Move to the right and the empathic traits begin to lessen in number, their effects less evident, and the narcissistic traits begin to increase and become more prevalent. Eventually, as one reaches the narcissistic group, on the right of this spectrum, the empathic traits have disappeared and all that remain are narcissistic traits, which become more numerous and stronger the further right one goes within this narcissistic group. Accordingly, with the codependent, he or she will have many empathic traits and they are strong in nature. Their devotion to love, their honesty, decency, excellent listening skills, positivity etc. are most evident and contribute to create a highly empathic individual. The narcissistic traits are almost invisible and the few that exist are weak. Accordingly, this prevalence of empathic traits attracts and is attracted to the prevalence of extensive and strong narcissistic traits. They lock together, complementing one another, and consequently the codependent is inexorably drawn to those within the narcissistic group, with next to nothing in terms of their own narcissistic traits to act as some kind of repellent. The empath may also find themselves shutting down, but more usually they are prevented from reaching a position of complete numbing through the intervention of a third party. Sure enough, the toll exacted on the empath is considerable and has damaging consequences, but, in general, they manage to avoid more often the fate of the codependent. Instead, rather than giving and giving until shutdown occurs, as is the case with the codependent, the empath's performance deteriorates in terms of fuel output in a more gradual fashion, which means that when it dips below a threshold of acceptability for our kind, the empath is also discarded. Not so damaged as to be unable to function, the empath will endeavor to reconnect with our kind, having sufficient energy and ability to do so, but they will be shunned as part of this discard until it is time to hoover them. Unaware of what they have been ensnared by and with capabilities improved after a period of respite arising from the discard, the empath is sucked back in by the narcissist and thus the narcissistic cycle continues. The empath, however, may also realize that something is wrong, or assisted by third parties and more amenable to listening, takes notice of what these third parties are telling him or her. They have a moment of awakening and with that realize that they must remain away from our grip, however hurtful and hard it may be, and thus they eventually escape, putting distance between them and our kind. The empath has numerous empathic traits and they are of strength, but they are not on the same scale as the codependent. The empath will have some narcissistic traits, not many and not especially strong in nature, but they will have more narcissistic traits than the codependent. Their status as an empath, along with the fact that there are more empaths than codependents, means that empaths become the bread and butter target for our kind. They too are attracted to us, not with the almost hopeless vulnerability of the codependent, but they remain not only attracted to our kind but a target. Finally, there is the super-empath. The super-empath is an excellent provider of fuel also and comes with a confidence and a fieriness which proves most tempting to our kind. The super-empath sees his or her role as helping, fixing, healing and brining goodness to those around them. They have considerable energy, they are capable, and their capacity for sustaining our abuses also makes them a considerably attractive prospect. The codependent can sustain considerable abuse until suddenly, like a light being extinguished, that is it. The empath also can sustain our manipulations, but their slide is slower and more gradual. The super-empath, blessed with a vast capacity for empathy and goodness, is also somebody who can sustain a lengthy campaign of abuse. There is no slide downwards with this individual like the empath. There is no sudden collapse like the codependent. Instead, the super-empath goes into supernova mode. The trait makeup of the super-empath is different from their cousins in the empathic group. Whereas the codependent has strong and many empathic traits with little and low narcissistic traits, and the empath has few and fairly low narcissistic traits but more and quite strong empathic traits, the super-empath has a different constitution. The super-empath has very strong and numerous empathic traits. He or she also has a number of narcissistic traits, more than the codependent and the empath but not as many as the narcissistic group, and they are stronger in nature than those experienced by the codependent and the empath. This arrangement is not problematic. Liken the super-empath's narcissistic makeup to the light from a candle and their empathic makeup the light from a spotlight. The intensity of the spotlight is so bright that the candlelight is barely noticed. Accordingly, the narcissistic element to the super-empath does not appear. The super-empath behaves in an empathic way and thus is a target for our kind. There comes a time, however, when the sustained abuse and the awareness of the super-empath reaches a critical point. Rather than switch off or slide into decline, the super-empath will decide that enough is enough. In some instances, this means that the super-empath will escape and follow a similar route to that of the empath and distance themselves from the narcissist. On other occasions they enter into supernova mode. When this happens, the super-empath will dim their empathic traits. This can only be dimming. The empathic traits cannot be shut off as they are wired into the empath's DNA. Moreover, this dimming can only continue for a period of time and is not permanent. The naturally strong empathic nature of the super-empath means that it will blaze bright again. However, when this dimming takes place, the gap between empathy and narcissism in the super-empath lessens so that the narcissistic traits are more prevalent. They do not dominate nor do they take over, but they are allowed to shine. However, whereas in our kind the application of our narcissistic traits is unfettered since we have no empathic traits and thus these traits are directed in a malevolent, harmful and destructive manner, the super-empath uses these unleashed narcissistic traits for good. This means that they will fight back against our kind and remain in the relationship with us. They will shut off the fuel provision, they will engage in manipulation of us, having learned how to effect it form their accompanying journey without kind. The super empath will wound and wound, striking blow upon blow against the narcissist. It is worth pointing out that the super empath does not necessarily know that they are with a narcissist. They may only realize this later, but rather they know that something is very wrong in the relationship and it must no longer continue. Thus, when some people ask the question, can you become a narcissist from being with a narcissist? Or, can I pick up narcissistic traits from my experience of being entangled with a narcissist? The answer remains no. But, if you find that you are exhibiting such traits and you are deploying them against the narcissist, what has happened is that you are allowing your inherent narcissistic traits to have greater prominence. You keep them under control and you are not allowing them to harm or hurt innocent parties, but rather you are applying them against the narcissist in order to strike back. You always had these traits, you have not gained them by being with us, but what you have learned is how to manipulate from being with us, and now you are turning those manipulations against us. The effect against us is varied. The lesser narcissist will discard immediately with a display of ignited fury as he seeks to escape the turning of the tables. He will need to get away from this empowered super empath and find a new primary source straight away. He wants to shrink from this blazing supernova of power which is causing him considerable difficulty through the cessation of fuel and the wounding from repeated criticism. The mid-range narcissist will find himself in a tormented loop as he tries to assert control. He will not comprehend truly what is happening. He will not want to lose the super empath owing to the fuel provision, but he is finding that his ability to manipulate and the reasonable degree of calculation that he has, is being sorely tested. He will try to assert his control through passive-aggressive means, even pleading with the super empath to stop and why can't you be good to me again? He will roll out the pity plays and sympathy cards in order to try to achieve superiority again. However, either the super empath decides to escape and leaves the mid-ranger in a confused and bewildered state, or the mid-ranger slinks away and discards, unable to sustain the fight and needing a new and far more compliant primary source. The greater narcissist will rail against this insurrection and fight back. He will draw on fuel from alternative sources, usually the IPSS or IPSSs he has in the wings, along with fuel from those NIS who are his inner and outer circle friends. He will relish the challenge shown by the super empath, and a real battle of wills ensues as each combatant deploys manipulation after manipulation against one another. This hammer and tongs clash of the titans sees the super empath applying what they have learned, similar to the apprentice turning on his or her master, as the old hand seeks to slap down the irreverent upstart. The super empath may withdraw and escape, satisfied that they have made their mark and scarred the greater. The greater may ultimately recognize that only a stalemate, for now, can ensue and breaks off, discarding the super empath and focuses on the acquisition of a new primary source, or more likely the promotion of an already ensnared IPSS. The greater, however, will not leave matters there. A note will be made to rejoin battle in due course and bring the super empath to heel. Thus the empathic supernova is when the super empath determines that enough is enough and he or she reduces their empathic traits, allowing the narcissistic traits to come to the fore, and in so doing he or she trains their sights on making life difficult, miserable and awkward for the narcissist. This is why our kind proceed with caution with the super empath. Their capacity for sucking up the abusive devaluation and their impressive fuel provision is tempting indeed, but reaching the critical point and causing the ignition of the empathic supernova can have dire consequences for our kind. Not for me, of course. I relish the challenge and the assertion of hegemonic dominance. Obviously,